You might find this a bit difficult to hear because it's very windy, but I thought of a few things to say. Which is that anytime you see God mentioned in the world, and when I say the world, I mean, places, names, parlance, manner of speaking, just America in general, and really the whole world. Anytime you see God mentioned, they're talking about Satan, or more accurately, they're talking about Lucifer, who, as we know according to the stories, desires to be like the Most High. And indeed, within the world, Lucifer elevates himself to the position of God. But it's like a little god, a little tyrant. In the worldly pursuit of pleasure. And it's a total affront to the real God. And by extension, an affront to Jesus, since Jesus is Son of the Father, Son of God. And no one knows the Father but the Son. The God of the Bible, Jehovah or Yahweh or however you want to say it. Have you noticed how this God favours the nations, and even Jesus when the Jews opposed him, he favoured the Gentiles or the Goyim. And I've even read rumours that, or I've read, let's say, interpretations or extrapolations that Gentiles doesn't necessarily mean nations, or that it's not really referring to non-Jews, but that's how we're going to frame it. So Jesus favoured the Gentiles, as in he favoured the nations, because the nations were more, or the pagans were closer to God, even though they worshipped their pantheon, their false gods. Even Jesus favoured the Gentiles over the Jews, because the Jews were like a disgrace to their own nation, and they have this double standard whereby, and the double standard carries through today, that the Jews are permitted to have their nation, but no other peoples are permitted to have theirs. And this is, it's been said, it's been discussed, it's been researched that communism is the brainchild of the Jew. So in the immediate Bolshevik revolution, they say it was something like 80% Jews. And that whole thing was nothing but the Jewish spite against Gentiles. Particularly, they have spite against those who foil their plans. For example, in I think it was the Second World War, when they killed Nicholas Tsar of Russia, he was onto the Jews. He knew what they were up to. and let's say the Jews, specifically the Illuminati, Adam Weishaupt and all that stuff. So he foiled their plans at one point. And for that, or it was somewhere during or after the World War I period. So then, as revenge, they made sure that they arranged to have Nicholas Tsar and his entire family pulled out of their house in the middle of the night and executed. And I believe they killed the children first, and then the mother, and then Nicholas, because that's how these Jews do things. But the Jews are the internationalists, and the Knights Templar, which purported, or at least in the exoteric sense, were Christian, and they called themselves the Knights of Christ, or Knights of the Temple, Knights Templar. But they were internationalists. They had banks and finance, and they had lawyers, and they ruled with signs and symbols and force and deception. And to this day, it's denied that the Templars were worshipping Baphomet. But there's enough evidence to say that the Templars despised Christ because they despise humility and innocence and grace, and they favour force, power, dominion, like Satan. And there's this rumour about they venerated John the Baptist over and above Jesus, and he was in the Seine, and this is where much of their doctrine evolved to be as it was with their Gnosticism. I'm not really quite sure. I've never really come to grips with the relationship between Jesus and John the Baptist. It's shrouded in mystery to me. But the Jews and by subsequent nature the Templars, and they're what's called internationalists. And though communism is the destruction of, or it's a destructive force, communism is not an empowering force. It's not a building up. It's a destruction. Communism's only meant to destroy. It's the other half of the equation, capitalism that builds up. Communism's only there to make way for capitalism. or they exist at the same time. But the point is that the Jews despise nations, and they call it, they call it the flag wavers, and for the same reason they despise monarchies, even if they rule from a good place. They hate it. They call it tyranny, because Jews always desire, or they always inspire to defraud and to cheat and to steal. So when you have a strong nation that forbids these kind of practices, the usury and it doesn't allow for liquidated currencies and this and that, they don't like it because they can't control the nation. So what have they done? They built up a giant network. Alf, come. They built up an entire international network of monetary fraud for purposes of liquidating the nations of the world, or let's say the Gentile nations. And there are many, many groups, the Templars and the Rosicrucians and the fraudulent monarchies, the satanic monarchies through the Phoenicians and the Warburgs and the Windsors, the Rothschilds. They're not appointed by God, they're appointed by Satan, and they are the internationalists that destroy the nations of the Gentiles against God's wishes. And within those melting pot slave states, there is only criminal rule, criminal activity. You know, it's the for the fact that everything's upside down. There's no justice, there's no honour, there's no mercy. It's all just ruled by criminals, ruled by outlaws. The outlaws rule, and through a degeneration of the human spirit, everyone becomes blind. And all these Gnostics and all of these false worshippers, false teachers in the denominated churches, they're all liars. They're all serving that international beast, which is the enemy of God. And these are the times we live in. There's barely a nation, or there is no nation in the world which is not subsumed under the arachnid, the spider of international web. And it's a testament to the creation of things like the internet, the interweb, that it's only on account of this international presence in the world that we're able to build up, like Babel, constructs like the internet and international banking and worldwide currency. But it doesn't last forever, because the living God intervenes in history. And all of the dead idols and the dead gods are totally unmatched by the kind of spirit that the living God commands. And the night dawns. The night approaches on the international God. And this is when the living God makes his appearance.